Hi, and welcome to our next lecture in Management 304. Today we are going to talk about training and development in cross-cultural context. Before I get in all the details, let me tell you my philosophy or my views on this type of topic. Many of you are probably not international business or HR majors. I suspect many of you come from, marketing, finance, accounting, economics background. And many of you, much as I used to, look at these types of things like training, development, HR, OB, touchy-feely things as something less important. People who do finance, people who do economics, accounting, strategy even, tend to be more respected and perhaps more paid in organizations. We always look at, or often look at, the experts in HR and human interactions as, they were just not smart enough to get a job on Wall Street, or were not smart enough to become a chief financial officer, so they became HR specialists. This philosophy, for some reason, and yeah, by the way, looking at, for example, student quality in different business majors, even including at the school, at the UNCG here, and much more so at other schools. When you look at, for example, average GPA or average SAT score or whatever other test you use to assess student ability, you will often find lower, I wouldn't say lower caliber students, but yes, students who perhaps have not such an impressive performance record. And those less impressive students tend to be in HR OB. This major is usually perceived as, soft core, easier for girls, whatever you want to define it. And I see that as a problem. My undergraduate and my master's were in hardcore economics. I used to teach statistics. I had all A's in my, for example, master's, which was economics and political economy. So I'm fairly good, or at least I have a proven, documented proof of my ability to do the tough stuff, things that not everyone is capable of doing. However, as I've been working with organizations, in organizations as an employee, with organizations as a consultant, one thing that I learned or realized is the soft side is equally and probably much more important than so-called hardcore side of the business, all that investment, trade, things that we usually see as the core of business. I know you don't believe me, and I know you kind of think, oh yeah, sure, but I'll give you just a few numbers. For example, if you trade on Wall Street, right, or if you are in some other finance or economics or other top discipline related job, usually if you're extremely good, you can improve your company's performance if you're lucky by a few percentage points. Like, for example, hardly any investor beats the market by more than 2-3% a year. Maybe some can do it as well as 5 or maybe even 10% a year, but hardly anyone does better than that. And you have to be extremely good even to reach that level. If you look, for example, at all those mutual fund managers, when you really plot their performance compared to the market, not that impressive. At best they get you an extra % or 2, but then if you subtract the fees that they charge, you usually end up where you would have been if you just had a passive portfolio, just basically put it in major index and didn't do anything. At the same time, when you look how much performance of the organization, including bottom line, basically profitability of the organization, can be improved thanks to a good HR specialist, we often see 2, 3, 4, and even 10-time-fold improvement in performance. For example, a well-designed compensation system can greatly boost performance of your employees. For example, hourly wage versus some kind of incentive profit sharing, performance goes easily, 50%, sometimes twice, and even more times. Same thing, for example, good training for your employees. Performance can dramatically improve virtually next day. So those things matter a lot. But the problem with them is that, I guess, the issue here is the so-called hindsight bias. My squirrel just jumped on the bird feeder, so it climbs on the window and then jumps out the window on the bird feeder and then basically eats all the seeds. So, but anyway, let's talk about training. So a good coach can substantially improve your performance, but the problem with that is, as I said, what I would call hindsight bias. What that is that, sometimes once we know the answer, we have this feeling that we knew it all along. And so when you talk to business managers, or when you talk to finance people, or people who make the decisions, executives, and you tell them, if you do it this way, performance of your employees will improve. For example, if you pay them not by the hour, but actually for performance, or if you deliver this kind of training, the performance will improve. And they say, oh sure, I knew it all along. The problem is that usually they didn't know it all along, even less so they thought about that before, and even less so they actually did it before. And so the things that HR specialists do, when you look at what they do, it's actually easy to comprehend. There is not really that there is nothing complex there, but it's fairly simple to understand once you know what to look for. So when you have, for example, financial things, all those derivatives, all those complex financial instruments, many people just look at that like, whoa, man, you blew my mind. I mean, I have no idea what you're doing. I trust that you know what you're doing, and I'll go with the flow. Whereas when you talk about HR things and you explain what you do and why you do it, people think, oh yeah, that makes sense. Actually, you know what? I kind of knew that too. And in reality, maybe they didn't know it. Or even if they did, they never thought about that. But the point here is that HR type of stuff carries less weight or is less impressive. And even though when you look at performance of all those derivatives and financial instruments, I mean, looking back at the last few years, we know that those financial experts actually had no clue what they did. And if it was not for all those bailout packages, we would probably have half of the banks that we have now, maybe even less than that. So they actually didn't do a good job. They actually did a crappy job. But just because it looked so complex and we were afraid to even, dig deeper and understand what's going on, we were, oh yeah, you guys know what you're doing, here is extra money for your work. Whereas, as I said, HR people are usually not allowed to do much, but when they are, performance often improves. But then we'll look and see what they did and like, oh, it's simple. Actually, why did I have to pay you? I could have done it myself. And that is the problem.
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? You say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17, house number 1. You say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy. It's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had, and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick. In most music, we think of the 1 as the downbeat, the beginning of the musical phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. But in West African music, the one is thought of as the end of the phrase, like the period at the end of a sentence. So you can hear it not just in the phrasing, but the way they count off their music, 2, 3, 4, 1. And this map is also accurate. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So let's never forget, whether at TED or anywhere else, that whatever brilliant ideas you have or hear, that the opposite may also be true. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
So now let's talk a little bit more about cross-cultural training. The video that I just showed you illustrates very well what cross-cultural challenges are all about. It's a difference in how we see things, and sometimes they are fundamental differences, things that we never expect. I mean, we take it as such a natural thing, you know, the way we do things, and when somebody comes and does it differently, we find ourselves very surprised. So before we get into the details, or the specifics, the technicalities, let me ask you a few reasonable questions. For example, question number 1. Let's say you have $20,000 that you can allocate to personnel training and development. And let's say you have about 12 employees in that department. What would be the most effective way to spend the money? You recognize a problem, you want to train your people. What would be the best way to spend the money? What kind of training would you offer? How would you go about it? Next one, what would be the return on investment in training? So you have $20,000, you spend the money. How much money do you get back, and how soon? For every dollar you invest, how much return do you expect? What are the most effective cross-cultural training methods? I mean, you will find lots of different consultants who will offer their programs to you. How do you know which one is the most effective one? And finally, how much should you spend on cross-cultural training for your employees? Should you spend at all any money? Should you spend a lot? What? Obviously, you don't know the exact answers to these questions. Obviously, the good answers start, well, it depends. And yes, you're right, it depends on the specifics of your organization, the specific situation you are in. But these are some of the questions that you as a manager will face once you manage people. And as you can imagine, each of these questions is not a simple one. Like, for example, what is the return on investment on your training? I mean, how the hell do I know how to calculate that? I mean, I can probably think of something, but can I really calculate that? Well, after this lecture, presumably you will be able to do it. At least that's what your take-home assignment will be about. But again, those are not easy questions. But more importantly, it's not even that they're more difficult to answer than many people think. The problem that I have with those questions is that hardly anyone ever asks those questions. I mean, we kind of assume we know what needs to be done, and we need, if we need some training for our employees, we just go through yellow pages or ask friends, and they say, oh, there is this consultant, Bob Eisenhower, he does a great job, why don't you hire him? You call Bob, Bob says, well, my training costs $10,000 a day. You think, well, what the hell, yeah, sure, let's try. And so you pay $10,000 and you kind of hope that it works. So Bob comes, delivers the training, people seem to be happy. Well, maybe the money was well spent. That's it. I mean, sometimes perhaps you will do some form of a post-training evaluation where you will survey your people and basically ask them if they like the training. But other than that, hardly anything is usually done. I mean, hardly ever people actually do more rigorous assessments. So you find a coach or trainer using your contacts or just randomly through yellow pages. You pay whatever they say you should pay. You hope it works. If your employees seem happy after the training, you kind of hope it means that it worked. But at the same time, how much, how many dollars you can expect back for every dollar you spend, you usually don't know. And worst of all, you usually don't even ask. Now, training is a big business. We're talking here about lots of money. So, for example, in the United States, and these are somewhat outdated figures, but American businesses spend close to $1,000 per employee per year on formal training. And then obviously there is much more spent, in, for example, on-the-job training, when someone trains someone, and that trainer or internal employee who shows the new employee how things should be done basically spends his or her time on training. time that you as an employer pay for. So that's obviously not accounted for. All kinds of other expenses that go into this, and we'll talk a little bit more in more detail later on about what exactly goes into training cost. If you look at the total global picture, in the United States, companies spend only on training about $90 billion annually. So that's a huge amount of money. It's like, half of the stimulus package that we've been fighting about so much a few years ago. It's not counting how much money is spent on higher education, which in a sense is training for the jobs. And again, that's another easily $82 billion spent in 2005, and probably much more today with the cost of education on the rise. There are some estimates that show that up to 2% of all payroll expenses are actually expenses on training. And again, that's a big deal for organizations. Even if you have only 100 people, that can sum up to hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes even millions. So depending on how many people you have. Talking specifically about cross-cultural training, I've seen figures that show that in the United States alone, $10 billion a year are spent on cross-cultural training and some other forms of cultural awareness training. So either way you look at that, it's a huge expense. Lots of money goes into this business. When you look in terms of training on the job, how much organizations spend time training their employees. Here are some figures. So here you have different countries as examples, and you have hours spent on training in the first 6 months after the employee took the job, as well as hours per year after then. And so as you can see here, first, it's a lot of time, so it's a lot of hours. Second, the United States actually doesn't compare very favorably to other countries in terms of how much training the companies provide. There are different reasons for that. One is the American system or training philosophy is that if you want to get training, go and get your MBA or bachelor's or whatever degree, and then come back to us. Though the training tends to be universal and external to organizations. You have a job, you want a promotion, you go, you study, you get a job. You get a degree, and then you apply for a promotion or look for a different job elsewhere. And in most cases, you would be looking for a different job. In other countries, particularly Asian cultures, well, not all of them, more like Japan, maybe South Korea, some European nations, employment tends to be more continuous or longer term. And so companies tend to be the primary source of training for employees. For example, in Germany, they have a system of, a well-developed, I must say, system of apprenticeship programs. So people join a company, and they would often join the company right after high school or their equivalent of high school, like Realschule. And they would be trained on the job continuously. And so they would basically get their education from the company where they work. And so at the same time, they would stay with that company for a long time. Companies there tend to be more unionized. People tend to stay with companies much longer, often for the entire lives. And so that, on the one hand, provides an incentive for the company to provide training to the employees. On the other hand, the employees much more value company-specific training as opposed to generalized training that may not be necessarily fully applicable at the job that they have. Same applies to Japan, to many other countries. In the United States, as I said, the training tends to be general and external to the organization. So people finish the high school, go and get a college degree or some vocational training, and then they take that universal degree and find a job. And then they stay at the job with their skills, and usually they receive little training on the job. And so if they want a better job or better pay or more responsibilities, they again go and take courses externally and then come back to the job they have and ask for a promotion or look for another job. The philosophy of American managers often is, oh, why should I pay for your training or train you? We will take that training, that experience, and find a job elsewhere, and the investment that I made will benefit someone else. There is some truth to that or some logic to that philosophy, obviously, but there is really no right or wrong. It just different things, different approaches in different countries. Sometimes American employees obviously would pay for your education externally. Like for example, teachers often would get, like when they're getting their masters, the school district would pay for their fees. I had a friend, for example, who worked for Texas Instruments, and he was getting his master's at the University of Texas at Dallas. Again, his employer paid for his education, and he would be taking classes, weekends, nights, online, and so that works too. But anyway, or in either case, it's a lot of money, a lot of investment for the companies, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. So here we see a typical exercise used in team building programs as well as cross-cultural team building programs. So people are just tossing balls to one another, and the number of balls is increasing over time, and presumably that teaches the team to work as a team in an increasingly complex environment. Now here is another exercise. Here a bunch of people are trying to kind of ski using one pair of skis, and so they just stand and walk together, and so someone soon enough figures out how to do it, and they start going with left, right, and the whole team moves together. Again, presumably this exercise teaches you to work as a team, right? This one is an all-time classic. It's so-called trust fall. So a person falls and trusts his team to catch him. And again, presumably this exercise builds trust in the team, builds closer relationships within the team. You probably have tried it, and it's kind of scary, but at the same time it's completely harmless.
Connect to the rhythm of life. Feel the heartbeat of your company. The drum is an ancient and powerful tool of communication and community building.
So this one is basically a drumming team building exercise or program. They are becoming increasingly popular in the corporate world. I'm not sure about their effectiveness, but they're sure a lot of fun.
Designed to unite, uplift, and inspire. Each participant receives a large African drum, and our skilled facilitators will transform any group into a rhythmic drumming orchestra.
Now here we have team building military style, basically like paintball type of exercise where, for example, the accounting department takes on the marketing department. And so again, they work as a team, as a military team. Again, presumably the shared sense of excitement and danger and interdependence makes a better team. Now, when I teach this course in class, I would also ask my students if they've ever participated in any cross-cultural training or team building programs, and I would ask them, what they liked and what they didn't. Sometimes I would actually offer them a typical team building exercise to do in class. I would split them in teams. I would give them a pile of paper, and the goal would be, for example, to build as tall a structure as possible using the paper that I gave them. And then again, presumably this exercise teaches them how to work as a team toward a common goal. The problem with this is that we don't really know if it works. When I ask my students, so did you like it, was it useful, they say, oh yeah, or not. But does it really work? And that's the fundamental question. That's the issue that will be basically, the main point of this lecture. Does it really work? And more importantly, how do we know if it does or not? How do we measure the effect of training programs? Now, the biggest challenge of cross-cultural training and team building training in general is that nobody really knows if it works or not. We kind of hope it works. If we see our employees being happy after the training, we think it works, but does it really? When we ask our employees or trainees if they had fun during the training or if they feel satisfied, it's not exactly the same thing as the training actually worked. What is the ultimate goal of the training? That is to improve performance in a particular task or in a particular task and provide more profit to the organization. Well, all those trust falls and ball tossing and stuff like that, do you really think they're gonna let you or help you sell more units of whatever you sell or make more units of whatever you make? Maybe so, maybe not. The problem is that hardly anyone ever tests that. And it's not easy to test, but it is definitely possible to test. Now, so the limitations of the training that I normally see or observe or even sometimes provide is that first, usually you wouldn't see any prior assessment of needs. Someone calls you and says that they want training. You may ask why, but hardly ever the trainers would actually come and do rigorous assessment of the situation before training. Measure satisfaction of the employee's performance, attitudes, conflicts, communication. They hardly ever do that. They're presumably trying to improve all those, but they hardly ever assess where we are. And without really knowing where we are, first, you can't design a good training program, and second, there is no way you will be able to say or tell if it actually worked, because if you don't know what was happening before, even if you know what happens afterwards, how do you know if it's an improvement or not? Second, there is usually no specific goal. Again, the goal is usually something very vague, more like, oh, well, let's do it to improve performance, or let's do it because everybody else does it, or we need to do something, so let's do training. But a specific goal is much more specific. Like, for example, we have a conflict in the team or organization due to, for example, lack of communication or stereotypes, and you pinpoint that very specific problem, and then you work on it. So you identify what the real problem is, and again, I'm talking here not about not enough performance or not high enough performance. I'm talking about a specific real challenge. Then you develop a program designed not to just be fun or exciting, but actually correct that specific problem. Now, there is usually no really pre-training training, and by that what I mean is hardly ever the organization would actually work with the trainees before they go into the training to hear their concerns, to maybe even cultivate the sense of need for the training, maybe hear what they have to say about the possibility of improving the results and stuff like that. And that is very important, because one thing that I see again and again and again is that you come and you participate in a training session, and then you observe the employees and you see lots of skepticism in their eyes. They would say, oh yeah, bullshit, I mean it's not needed, or it's not gonna help, or they don't know what they're doing, or oh, the real problem is, let me tell you what the real problem is. It's not what the management thinks, or it's not what the coach thinks. I'll tell you, it's, Bobby and Willie had that conflict, and that led to escalation of problems in the entire team and stuff like that. So hardly ever coaches, trainers go that deep and talk to those employees before the training starts. And as a result, employees don't really accept the idea that it may help. They sometimes actively sabotage the training, and in many cases they just do it because, well, nice way to be, get a day off. Hardly ever there is a rigorous analysis of what exactly will work best. Again, the trainers or coaches will have their favorite programs and they deliver it to everyone. But again, it's not always one size fits all. Sometimes you actually have to decide or determine what the specific problem is, and then try to analyze which of the available training tools will do the best job to fix this particular problem, right? In many cases, again, from what I see, the training programs are a collection, and in many cases a collection of random exercises. Again, lots of things, all those ball tossing discussions, different seminars, but they wouldn't have a common theme where, one leads to another, to another, to another, to a common goal or an outcome that the training program seeks to achieve. So especially when we talk about cross-cultural training, especially when we talk about team building, as I said, the program will be comprised of little blocks, each of them being interesting and fun, but in many cases, as I said, not really handing together, not really working together to achieve or fix that particular goal. The focus is almost always on interesting as opposed to effective. Trainers are, and probably rightfully so, very interested in making their trainees excited and enjoy the training. The problem is that in many cases these training sessions become almost like entertainment sessions or performance sessions as opposed to training. And in many cases what you experience during a training program is basically what you would experience if you went to a movie theater or some other entertainment event. And again, while it feels good to be part of it, while it leaves you happy at the end, it doesn't necessarily improve or will improve your performance tomorrow on the job and will provide more money for the company, right? And in some cases, what I also see, I'll even give you a few examples. I would see sometimes advanced techniques used inappropriately. It's like, a guy takes a knife and so like, for example, you can perform a surgery skillfully and cure a problem, but sometimes you can basically just cut the patient's body and leave it wounded. And so that's exactly the same with the psychological tools that you can use in training. You can fix a problem or you can do more harm. For example, once I observed a training where employees of an organization were taken to some kind of retreat, and one of the exercises was where the employees would be, where the trainees would be sitting in a circle, and the goal was, and they would have like a big white piece of paper in the middle, and they each had a red and a black marker. And their goal was to draw a red line to a person in the group, in the team that they like most, and a black arrow to a person whom they hate most or don't like most. And so it's a very powerful exercise. It usually or sometimes has the power of fixing some team dynamics problems. In this particular case, the exercise was basically the exercise and nothing else. So the people openly declared whom they love and whom they hate, and the coaches said, okay, well, now talk about it for a few minutes and hopefully it will help you. And the people were sitting just like, all right, what do we do now? And they didn't do anything. And so when next morning they came to work, my sense was that it didn't help. I mean, yesterday you told this guy that you hate him. I mean, how are you supposed to work together today? So it could have been an important step towards healing the problem, but without proper intervention, without proper application of this exercise, you basically just make it worse. I mean, you basically, wounded the group rather than healed it. So now, as a bonus for watching this lecture, here is a question that is likely to appear on the exam. So let's see if you know the answer. For those of you who are listening to this lecture, let me read out the question for you. One of the biggest limitations of existing training programs is that A, they're very expensive, B, they're often offered by external consultants who have little knowledge about the client organization, C, they are offered by internal staff who may have extensive knowledge about the organization but have limited skills in developing and delivering cross-cultural training programs, and D, the programs tend to be one-size-fits-all and rarely involve tailoring to the needs of a particular client, and even less commonly assessed in terms of their effectiveness and return on investment. And the correct answer obviously is D. Now, as an illustration, let me give you a list of questions that you will have to answer when delivering training for your multinational company, either for your employees at the headquarters or your employees at the local subsidiaries overseas. These are not necessarily very difficult questions. You will probably be able to answer them eventually. The point of listing them here is just to show you how many little things you will have to deal with in order to deliver the training. So you will have to, for example, design who's going to deliver the training. Are those going to be your experts from the headquarters? Are those going to be your local experts at the subsidiary? Or maybe third parties, maybe professional coaches? How would you be delivering the training? So would it be something done online, or would it be face-to-face, or in some other form? How language differences would be handled? For example, would you be delivering the training in English, or will you use the language of the country of your subsidiary? who's going to be doing the translation? So if you send someone from the headquarters, and obviously they wouldn't, or in most cases they wouldn't be fluent in the local language, who's going to translate for them? Or if you decide to use whatever language, there will be probably people there who will not be able to speak freely the language. And there are tons of other questions that you will have to deal with. Again, the point here is not to answer them now in this lecture. The point is to show you how many little things you will have to deal with, like for example, again, going on with the questions, should the employees from the headquarters be handled differently than employees at the subsidiary? How would you deal with the cross-cultural differences, differences in people's perception of justice, motivation, compensation, legal differences? So all those will have to be answered. And it's, again, as I said, it's not really that it's impossible to answer those questions. It's just for you as a manager, you will have to take all that stuff into account, give it enough thought, and make thoughtful decisions. Now again, very briefly, and I posted these slides on Blackboard so you can just download it and read it, but just a brief overview of the different types of training that are available to you. So you would have, for example, programs that are purely informational. So you may have lectures or maybe some form of online videos or some other form of training where the goal is to deliver information to the trainees. And so the pro of this method is that, yes, if the goal is to provide knowledge to your employees, this form of training is the best one. But it's often boring, it may be time consuming. The quality greatly depends on the lecturer. Some are, skillful lecturers who can, captivate the audience and make them excited. Some may be just boring talking heads, probably what you have now in this lecture. So the same thing, like for example, readings, movies, distance learning. Again, if you just need to provide information, why just not print a book and let your employees read? But then again, it's usually going to be too superficial. It usually, like especially if you need to deliver or produce some kind of printed or video material, it may be expensive to do. Not everyone may have the skills to do it. So sometimes it may be just difficult to do, and it may not do the job. Experiential training is much more effective, it's much deeper. So for example, if you want to teach your employees how to collaborate globally, you can write them a manual or you can deliver them a lecture. But if you actually put them in teams of people from different countries and let them work together for a while, that experience likely will have a much more profound effect on their skills than any lecture can ever deliver. But then again, the negative of this approach is that it's much more resource intensive. It takes more time, it takes more money, more resources to develop and deliver. Finally, sometimes training can be what we call emotional or relationship enriching. So all those retreats and barbecues together and fun together, that training does not necessarily teach your employees any new skills or doesn't necessarily teach them how to work as a team, but it has the effect of acting at a very deep level, developing this kind of mutual respect among the people, liking one another. So sometimes, a night around a campfire will do much more than hours and hours of lectures, because people become closer together. They like one another more, so they enjoy working together more. And so that is not easy to design, doesn't always work. The same approach doesn't work for everyone. Like for example, I don't know, I can't imagine my mom around a campfire, but sometimes it does, and if it's done right, it may actually have the most positive effect on performance. Now, in terms of training settings, you obviously can do it internally, group sessions, on-the-job type of training. So you can have, for example, like apprenticeship or some kind of co-op training or some form of mentoring. And so the pro of this approach is obviously that it can be cheaper, faster, and maybe potentially better knowledge of the needs of the trainees that the coaches would have. For example, for your take-home assignment, the goal is that, well, now you know where you want to do business, now you selected your people, you have to train them. And so you are sending someone overseas, for example, and how do you train that person to be an effective performer or effective employee at that new location in a foreign country? And so you can simply assign that person to some kind of mentor or some kind of experienced worker at that subsidiary, and that mentor will basically, lead the person and teach him how to operate in this new environment. And so presumably that guy, that buddy or mentor, if you will, knows what's going on and can teach the new person, and so it wouldn't really cost you much other than paying for the time of the mentor. But at the same time, not everyone is capable of being a mentor. Not everyone has the skills and the knowledge to provide that kind of training. So as a result, this training tends to be very unstructured and in many cases not very effective. I mean, I don't know, like look at yourself, for example. Would you be able to teach someone how to survive at the UNCG? You probably think that you would, but then look around. Do you see people, or do you know people at the UNCG who could teach you how to survive the UNCG? Like you look at your buddies around the classroom, if you are in the classroom, and I don't know, I mean, how many of you do you really think would be able to provide valuable kind of orientation or immersion type of training? I don't know, maybe not all of them. Also, one of the problems with using people internally, and again, you probably will not fully understand what I'm trying to say here now, but when you experience it, you will know exactly what I mean. There is this saying that there is no prophet in his own land. Well, that's exactly the thing. So somehow we tend to trust more external expensive consultants than people in our own organization. And I don't know if that's because we value what we have to pay for, or it's some other type of biases or bias. But somehow people don't take or don't value, and as a result don't internalize the results of training provided by internal resources. And so sometimes just the mere fact that you're inviting a big name consultant may make your employees take the training more seriously, and as a result learn more. Then obviously we can outsource training to professionals, and sometimes it actually can be cheaper. So often it actually costs a lot of money, but sometimes it may be cheaper. I mean, consultants, that's what they do for a living, and they have everything developed now. They have the programs structured and in modules ready to be delivered, and you just pay them, they come, they teach, they go. Whereas if you have to do it internally, just the development and preparation may cost you so much money that even though you don't really pay anything extra to the people who deliver the training, the sheer time that you spend on preparing the program, researching what needs to be done, preparing it, it may actually cost much more than just hiring the professionals. And then obviously in terms of the settings, indoor, outdoor, not going to talk about that. You understand, one is cheaper, the other one is more expensive, but the one is more boring. If you do it, indoor, nothing really changes, so people just don't take that seriously enough. Whereas when you take the people outdoor to some kind of campsite, situation changes, everyone's excited, everyone's looking forward to the training, and so as a result, people tend to be much more receptive of the new ideas and tend to perform much better afterwards. In terms of the general training types, obviously, some training types or training programs are designed to improve skills and knowledge. And those, by the way, are fairly easy. Like, for example, you are implementing a new software, or maybe you're using some new compensation system, and so you need to teach your people how this new system works. In most cases, the reason it's easy is not because it's a very simple type of knowledge, but because you know exactly what type of knowledge needs to be delivered, and so you know the goal and you deliver the training. It becomes much more challenging when you have to alter attitudes or improve motivation or improve interpersonal relations in your group. That's much more difficult because the goal, the ultimate goal may be clear, but the specific little tasks that need to be performed, the specific little goals that need to be achieved are much less common. So we kind of know that we want to make our employees happier, or make them care more about their customers or about their co-workers, but we usually don't really know what needs to be done in order to achieve those goals, and that's what makes this training very challenging and very difficult. Now, here is a question that is likely to appear on the exam. It's kind of difficult to read it out because it has blanks in it, so those of you who are listening to the question, you would have to actually watch the video lecture to know the answers. So let's take a minute and see if you know the answer. And the answer is A. Good attitude correction training is usually much harder to design and deliver than technical skill training. Now, why would you ever want to provide attitude type of or attitude improvement training? So why would you need to offer that touchy-feely stuff? Well, in many cases, first, cross-cultural awareness and cross-cultural training is actually falls into this category. It would be attitude correction training, so it would, be one that is aimed to minimizing prejudice or stereotyping, or improving or maximizing empathy for people from different cultures and stuff like that. And so why would you want to do that? Well, in many cases, organizations do this kind of training or provide this kind of training because of compliance issues. So they basically may be required to provide all kinds of cross-cultural training to their employees. Like, for example, most universities are required to provide cross-cultural training to their international students so that they know how things are done in America, for example. And they just do it not necessarily because they genuinely believe that it's necessary. Hardly ever they actually evaluate whether it helps or not. They just do it because every other school does it. Sometimes it's also, giving your employees something extra, like being a good employer. So these types of training tend to be much more fun than, for example, lectures and stuff. And so you kind of, you're not sure if it's going to work. You're not even sure if it's needed. You definitely don't know if it's going to improve your performance. But, you kind of hope that it will make your employees happy. They will see that they are appreciated, and hopefully they will appreciate you as an employer more. So you offer this type of training. And sometimes, you kind of just want to improve general organizational climate. You're not sure if, what exactly you want to do, but you just kind of hope that it will make everyone happier and as a result more productive. The correct way, or the proper reason for delivering this kind of training, is when you want to improve a specific type of problem or specific type of skill. And so there you normally would have, like, for example, a specific issue or conflict or some other problem that is identifiable, and the training would be designed to fix that problem. And so, for example, you have some kind of racial tension in your team, and so you might want to deliver a training of that type. Or maybe you had some problems with, how your immigrant customers are treated and stuff like that, and so you might want to offer that cultural sensitivity training. And so in those cases, it actually may be a very effective way to improve your bottom line. Also talking about team building. Again, this is probably the sexiest form of training, so everybody talks about it, everybody believes that team building is important. But at the same time, nobody first really knows if it works. Hardly anyone ever evaluates if it works. And finally, and very importantly, we understand why we want to offer team building training to your employees, right? We want stronger teams. It's all about teamwork. Our team has to be strong in order to win this competition and stuff like that. But what many people often don't ask is, why not offer team building training? And so the answer is maybe, don't have to be, but maybe, maybe there are better ways to use that time and that money. And maybe it would be better to deliver other types of training. Or maybe rather than training a team, you should train individuals, and maybe that will lead to better performance and more noticeable results faster. And again, maybe not. But those questions have to be asked before you jump on this, bandwagon of teamwork. And again, teamwork is very important. In fact, frankly, I'm kind of sounded negative about that, but that's what I do. I specialize in team training and particularly work with global virtual teams. So I do believe that, why? Well, there are many whys you should do it, and those are all very important. But at the same time, it's nice to, have the devil's advocate on your team who will say, oh, maybe we should spend that money or that time elsewhere. Now, goals of team building. Well, obviously, you may want to improve the ability of your team to complete specific tasks as a team. So when you have a complex task that requires collaboration of the team members, the team building may be designed to teach them how to work as a team. It can be from, passing a ball in a soccer game, all the way to how do you edit a document as a team that is geographically dispersed. How do you use, for example, Google Docs or Dropbox or something else? Sometimes the team building training is designed to help people meet one another, learn more about one another. My personal research shows that the more people are familiar with one another, the better they actually perform. In fact, studies show that even sometimes you would have a global virtual team where people don't meet face to face at all, but when you ask them to spend 5 minutes on schmoozing, basically, talking about things that are not related to the task, those teams actually tend to perform better down the road. So those teams where there is more than just the task that unites the people, they actually perform better. So all those whitewater rafting, all those camp trips, even though they don't necessarily teach people how to work as a team, they allow people, provide the opportunity to meet one another, to discover common interests, to maybe help people spend some time together and learn what others are like and what they, how they think and how to be around them. Sometimes you would even have some little romance going on, and that's okay. That makes the team usually better performing team. Same thing, like for example, experiences. Like sometimes the training program would be designed to create a shared experience. That's especially true of the programs designed, or built around excitement. Like for example, as I said, whitewater rafting. So there people wouldn't talk much to one another. So it wouldn't really be about me meeting you, but the fact that we had that common adventure makes us closer. So when we come to work next morning, we all of a sudden have something to discuss. Like, oh, remember, like, when Billy fell out of that boat and nearly died in that river? Well, that, gives you some shared common experience, and that makes you closer. Conditional reflex. Sometimes, the training programs are designed to almost create this feeling that, being in team feels good, and so people value their team membership more. And sometimes, almost, shame to say, but sometimes the team building programs are not really designed to build a team, but to reward a team. So sometimes people would be taken on all those trips, not because the goal is to use that trip as a team building exercise, but more, guys, you did well. We want to reward you, so let's put you all on a bus and take you to Paris to presumably some kind of agricultural machinery exhibition, but more as a thank you, as a fun trip to reward your performance. And that latter one, by the way, I once participated in that when I worked for a company that was selling agricultural machinery. After a good year of performance, the best people were put on a bus and taken to Paris, again, presumably to participate in an exhibition, but a big part of that trip was to basically, reward the people who worked so hard the whole year. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. Now, let's talk a little bit about global virtual teams. Your textbook has a few pages on the topic, and I just happen to have spent the last 3 years of my life researching this particular issue. I run a project that I call Acculture that is not part of this course, at least not as I recorded this lecture. It may be in the future. But for those who haven't participated in it, and some of you might have participated in Acculture as part of my Management 301 course, so you know what that is. Those who haven't, the idea is very simple. We take students from all around the world, and last semester, for example, we had 3,000 students from 75 schools in 43 countries. We put those students in global virtual teams. Usually it's 7 students, 7 countries, and they work together for 1 semester designing or developing a business plan. And so the goal of this project is to give students an opportunity to experience first-hand challenges of cross-cultural collaboration and hopefully learn best practices of cross-cultural collaboration. And so even though the project was originally designed to be a purely educational exercise, it actually became a very important research platform. So we observe those teams. We have hundreds of teams every semester, and so we see what works, what doesn't. We try to research how global virtual teams can be made perform better, or what can help them perform better. And so many of these issues that I discussed in the textbook, I actually researched myself, and there are some things that the book doesn't talk about, but that I know from my own research. And so here are some observations or some results of my research in no particular order. First, what are global virtual teams? Well, they are global, so meaning that they are geographically dispersed. The team members would be in different locations, in many cases in different countries. Second, they are virtual as opposed to face-to-face. So the communication would be taking place in the cyberspace. So it would be either via internet or by phone or some other forms of communication where you don't really sit in the same room. Now, obviously, they have many drawbacks. Those teams tend to be less personal. People tend to be less familiar with one another, so there is less cohesion in the team. In many cases, it wouldn't even feel like a team. It just feels more like, oh, those are just people that I work with, but we're not really a team as you would, have that sense of belonging, that sense of unity that you would have in a traditional team. They tend to satisfy less the need for socialization. Again, when you deal with or work with people who are with you all the time, you socialize, whereas when you communicate or work on a task with someone from China or Ukraine or Canada, you tend to be much more task focused and there is much less social element. And obviously, because you're geographically dispersed, you in many cases deal with the time zone differences, which again slows down your performance. But they also offer lots of pros. For example, no need to commute. So you can have a team of people, experts, world-class experts, and you don't have to bring them to one location. So they can work together from the convenience of their own location, room, office, and that's a huge deal. It's much cheaper, in many cases much faster. You can have what we call a global relay, where, for example, a guy in North America works for 8 hours, passes his work to a guy in Asia. That one works for 8 hours or whatever time, passes it to a guy in Europe who works for another 8 hours. By the time the American guy wakes up again, the work has now been, or more work has now been completed, and he just takes on from that point. And so the team virtually never stops working. So sometimes those teams tend to be much more productive. And also, interestingly, the virtual teams are much less prone to visible attribute prejudice. So here is this, kind of cartoon. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And that is true. I mean, unfortunately, in cross-cultural context, stereotypes, prejudice, even racism are very much the case, or a concern, I guess. But when you have a global virtual team, people don't see one another, so they don't see each other's, race or ethnic background. In many cases, they wouldn't even know if the other party is a man or a woman. And believe me, it happened to me a lot of times. Like you have someone named Yati Zakaria from United Arab Emirates. Would that be a man or a woman? I worked with the person for a long time, but it was not until she asked me to write a reference letter to her, and I put he, assuming that it was a man, and she said, oh, no, I'm a woman. So we had productively collaborated without even knowing, at least I didn't know if she was a man or a woman. And so that usually removes some of those problems, like women tend to be discriminated against, maybe people of, color or whatever else may be discriminated against. And in virtual settings, all you see is whatever the person types in Skype. Or in email, or if you use Skype, I guess you see each other's face, but it's still, the prejudice tends to be much lower. Now, the problem with global virtual teams is that they can be high performers, so if you manage them right, they can perform very well and even sometimes much better than the traditional teams. But if you manage them poorly, they tend to perform very poorly as well. And so here is a picture or diagram from Di Stefano and Masnevsky's work. Martha Masnevsky is one of the leading researchers on global virtual teams in our field. And so as I said, her research shows that, and my research definitely shows that too, that you kind of have that split equilibrium. Teams that are managed well, teams that are structured well, global virtual teams, they usually tend to perform extremely well and may even do better than traditional teams. Just like with, for example, online classes. I mean, for students for whom it works, and if the class is designed well, online courses may be much more effective because you can do them, at your convenience, in a location where you are, you don't have to commute, so they may work well. But if they are not designed well, it's a disaster. I mean, they may be much worse than the ones where, have in class or, traditional team. So it's all about structure, organization, leadership, and management. Very important. Now, back to what I've learned. Well, for example, my research shows that time zone dispersion creates a huge problem for teams, whereas geographic dispersion doesn't really. So we would have teams composed of people from Asia, Europe, and North America, and the dispersion wouldn't really have any effect. At least they wouldn't perform any worse than, for example, all American dispersed teams. So in both cases, vice versa. If you have the time zone dispersion, they would perform much, much, much worse than the teams that are composed of people, for example, from Canada, the United States, and some Latin American countries. So the geographic dispersion doesn't seem to have a strong effect. So as I said, we would have, for example, sometimes teams that are all American or all Italian, but each student is in a different city. And you would have a globally dispersed team, but it would be dispersion within the same time zone. And so the teams that are merely separated by kilometers or miles usually perform equally well as the teams that are not separated by kilometers and miles. But once you add time zone difference to that separation, and that's where the whole, hell breaks loose, that's where you become, the team becomes much, much less productive. Less communication, definitely so. In controlled samples or controlled studies, experimental studies where we would have global virtual teams and regular cross-cultural teams where people communicate face-to-face. In virtual settings, people communicate much, much less. They would sometimes limit their communication to a few emails per week, and that's it. When you have people face-to-face, obviously, and you would expect that, people communicate much more. They get together, they may be talking for hours. There is much less personal contact in virtual teams, much more focus on the task. And that may be a negative thing or maybe a positive thing. The negative part is obviously that people can work together for an entire semester and not know much about each other's hobbies, preferences, even gender, as I said. But at the same time, these teams tend to be much more task-oriented. All communication is about the task, and so they tend to be much more, I would even say, efficient. So they're not swayed away by all kinds of talks about girls and cars and movies and stuff like that. And again, I'm not sure if it's a good thing overall, but it definitely makes the team more efficient. We also see much more procrastination in global virtual teams, and I'm not sure if that's because people feel less obliged to meet the deadlines because the people that they're kind of obliged to, their team members, are not here, or it's something else. But people tend to wait much longer until they actually start working compared to traditional teams. In fact, if you don't impose many deadlines, a global virtual team tends not to do anything up until almost the last week of the assignment and sometimes the last day of the assignment. So procrastination in organization definitely is an issue. One unexpected finding is that cultural differences are much less of a problem, or much less a problem than expected. So you would think that you have people from all around the world and cultural differences would be a major factor, or the same for the same matter, language differences. Our research shows that no, virtually never students complain about that as a challenge. But coordination and leadership, that's where really problems are happening. So that purely technical side, how you distribute the tasks, who is in charge of the schedule, how do you agree on the schedule, how do you decide how you co-edit the document. So those technical coordination and leadership issues are much, much more often are described as a challenge, as a problem. And when you look at how people handle cultural versus coordination issues, teams that focus more on the coordination and the technical side tend to actually perform much better. Interesting studies on the topic. When you have a bunch of teams and you ask half of those virtual teams to spend 5 minutes getting to learn each other, whereas the other team just gets right into the task, the performance is dramatically different. In some studies, people looked, or researchers looked at the actual performance, like quality of the reports that the teams write. And we actually looked at that. So we would ask teams if they spent any time schmoozing, and those that did, they actually would produce a better report. And some other studies looked at, for example, negotiations in the virtual context. And again, the teams or negotiating partners that spent just a few minutes on getting to know one another, and when you especially add a picture of the person and so on, they were twice as likely to reach an agreement in the negotiation than the team that didn't. So like, for example, in that particular study I'm thinking about 30% of the teams that got right into the task were able to reach an agreement, whereas 70% of the teams, the negotiations failed. Whereas for the teams that had that schmoozing session, about 65%, actually more than twice as many, actually did reach an agreement. Now, in global virtual teams also, what we noticed is that there is much more, how should I put it, negative comments and animosity going on. And again, I'm not sure if that's because it's easier to be nasty towards someone you don't really see. You just type the message in your, peer evaluations online or and in email, as opposed to a person who sits across the table from you and you actually see him or her. But somehow, you would see much harsher comments in global virtual teams about team members than you would see in a face-to-face team. Another study we just actually submitted to a journal shows that what we call perceived distance paradox. The hypothesis normally is that the more diversity there is in the team, the more challenges the team will experience. If you have language differences, cultural differences, work style differences, those tend to have a negative effect on team performance, and usually that's what we see. But there is also what we call psychic or perceived distance paradox, and that's when the perceived differences actually aid performance, improve performance. So when we ask people how similar or different they see the cultures of their team members, surprisingly, those who see them as more different tend to perform better. And again, it may be because people are more afraid of those differences or more aware of those differences, so they tend to over-prepare and as a result perform better. But surprisingly, that type of difference, unlike other types of difference, actually has a positive effect on performance. Finally, and you have to experience it to truly understand it, but global virtual teams tend to be much, much slower, and that's due to slow communication. Imagine that you work with people, for example, from China, from here in the United States, and so you have about a 12-hour difference. You send an email to that person today. That's night in that country, right? So it will not be until your tomorrow that the person sees the message. But your tomorrow, or end of the day, when the person sees the message, your day is over, so you are asleep or whatever you do at night. And so when the reply comes to you, it will not be until your next day before you can actually see the message. So it takes 2 or even 3 days just to send a message and get a reply and send it back. And so what may take literally 5 minutes for people who are in the same time zone, it may take 3 days, like 36 hours or more, for people who are in different time zones. So it may be 2 days. Well, I guess 3 is an overkill, but 2 days just to get a reply to your email. And so obviously communication online becomes very slow, and as a result the teams take much longer to perform a task. Now here's a question again that was likely to appear on the exam, so I'll read it out for you. The following is true about global virtual teams. A. Compared to traditional teams, stereotypes and prejudice have a much stronger effect on GVTs. B. Geographic distance impedes performance in GVTs more than does time zone distance. C. GVTs always outperform global traditional teams. And D. Challenges stemming from cultural differences have a stronger effect on GVT performance than issues of coordination and leadership. And actually the correct answer here is none of the above is true. So I should probably add this fifth option because all of these are not correct. So all of the above are not true. My apology, I didn't think about that, but now you know that all these 5 are not true. So compared to traditional teams, in global virtual team stereotypes are actually less of an issue. Geographic dispersion impedes performance less than time zone dispersion. Global virtual teams do not always outperform traditional teams. They can, but don't always outperform them. And technical challenges tend to be much more important than cultural differences. Now, let's talk a little bit about global mindset or cultural intelligence. One of the goals of cross-cultural training is usually to improve cultural intelligence or develop the global mindset. And your book talks about that. I happened to do a lot of research on this topic, and so I'm gonna give you my point of view on the issue. First, cultural intelligence. And again, global mindset is not really that different. I mean, there may be some slight differences in definition, but basically that's the same thing that we're talking about. And so lots of research has been done on this topic, and when we talk about cultural intelligence, we normally differentiate among different dimensions. And the following four are the most commonly discussed ones. Like, for example, motivational dimension. Are you interested in contacting other cultures or interacting with other cultures? Do you enjoy those kinds of interactions? So that's what goes in motivational. So some people are very interested, others are very, no, I don't want to deal with those internationals. Cognitive, so that's basically your knowledge. Do you know much about other cultures? Do you know much about working with people from other cultures? So it's purely knowledge. And again, you can have a lot of knowledge but not be motivated or interested to work with people from other cultures, or vice versa. You may be very open to that kind of experience, but you have no knowledge. Behavioral, do you adjust your behaviors? Do you do things in the right way when you deal with people from other cultures? So you, for example, may know how it's done, but you may not necessarily do it. Like, you may not bow when you deal with people from Asia. You may not be culturally sensitive in your comments. So it's not always right. Next, metacognitive. Again, do you think about how you think when you are in these situations? And this is the highest level. So not many of us actually analyze how we feel, how we think about this whole process. And again, all four dimensions are largely independent, and so you can score high on, for example, motivational but low on behavioral cultural intelligence or global mindset for the same reason. Now, there are different models and different dimensions and different models. I'm actually working now with a team of researchers trying to develop our own global mindset and cultural intelligence instrument, and we end up with only 3 dimensions, or at least our data shows that there are only 3 dimensions. I can say that our measure is better than others. I'd like to think so, but the point here is that there are different models, and we're still a long way from fully understanding the phenomenon. Now, talking about CQ measures, cultural intelligence measures, you have the IQ and you have CQ, cultural intelligence. Well, let me tell you, it all sounds very good on paper. Your textbook talks about it in a very positive way, almost like we got it all figured out. The problem is that pretty much all existing instruments for measuring cultural intelligence rely on self-report. In other words, they rely on respondents, on people who are being assessed, to tell you how culturally intelligent they are. And this is fundamentally different from how we measure, for example, IQ, so cognitive abilities. For example, when we measure IQ, the questions would be in their basic form like this one. 2 plus 2 equals, and you have to give the answer. And there is a right answer and a wrong answer. And so depending on how many questions you answer correctly, your score will change. And again, 2 plus 2, obviously, it's too simplistic, but that's the idea. When we measure cultural intelligence, just about every existing instrument would ask you something like this. On a scale from 1 to 7, how well would you say you know what 2 plus 2 is? And that is completely different than just asking what is 2 plus 2. So when we measure cultural intelligence, at least the existing instruments, and some items, by the way, in the instrument that I'm trying to develop with my colleagues, the questions wouldn't be what is the right way to behave in this particular situation, or what is the correct answer about this particular culture. The questions would be, on a scale from 1 to 7, how interested are you to interact with people from other cultures? Or on a scale from 1 to 7, how often do you adjust your behavior when you're in a new cultural environment? And that is not the same as actually observing someone's behavior or actually asking someone a question that has a right and wrong answer. And so here we're dealing with the self-report and self-evaluation. And what I think about my ability or cultural intelligence may be far from what actually my cultural intelligence is. And it's not even because I may be lying. It's not even because I may be interested in providing socially desirable answers. It just may be because I don't know. I don't have a point of reference. And so that makes these skills, if not completely useless, then definitely a little suspicious. There are some attempts to do it right, like for example in the instrument that I'm developing with my colleagues, we have a bunch of questions that have right and wrong answers. So we would ask questions about cultures, and so they would be right or wrong. Unfortunately, those questions work best for the cognitive component, where you test somebody's knowledge about other cultures. It's not easy to design questions like that for example, behavioral component. There you just, either observe behavior, which is very expensive and difficult because you would have to put the people in that specific culture and see how they perform, or you would have to trust the self-report, and so that's the problem. There is a team led by David Thomas at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. They developed an instrument that is actually much more like the IQ test. So the respondents would be shown a series of videos, and each video depicts a situation, and then the respondents would be asked to, for example, say what the correct response should be in that particular situation, or who was right and who was wrong in their behavior, those kinds of things. The problem with that instrument is that it was not only very difficult to deliver, it's extremely difficult to score. So you literally have to go through tons of information, and you have to, it's very laborious just to get that score. And so as a result, they charge a lot of money for that instrument being used. And so it's not an easy one to administer, not an easy test to administer. But at least that's a step forward. So as I said, it's probably even better than what we have and what we do. It's just very expensive and very time consuming. Now let's talk a little bit about acculturation or culture shock and all that, cultural adjustment. So you send someone to a new country, and so that person tends to go through several stages of adjustment. Normally, the first few weeks, the person would experience what we call a honeymoon period. Everything is new, everything is exciting, exotic, and that's when people feel like they are fully adjusted and they are fully integrated in the new culture. But then a few days later, or a few weeks later, the person has to deal with the challenges of life. You have to get a new driver's license, you have to find an apartment, you have to open a bank account, you have to communicate with people, and you realize you don't speak the language. You get into a tricky situation, how to deal with that, and that's when we have this, what we call disillusionment or culture shock stage. That's where people are like, whoa, what's going on? And then I don't really like it here. But then over time, people learn their ways, they learn, how the stuff works, and they slowly start adjusting, and then presumably eventually at some point they fully integrate into the new society or into the new culture, and then become fully adjusted. Now, I actually tested this hypothesis, this model, in my doctoral dissertation years ago. I was looking at immigrants in Canada, and I had people in my sample. I had about 2,000 people total, and in that sample, some of them were immigrants who just arrived in Canada, and then some who've been here for a year, 2, 3, so on, up until I believe 25 years since immigration. And I was trying to measure, among other things, how integrated they are in the culture, and yes, I definitely saw at least the last 3 stages or 4 stages. Honeymoon, I didn't have fine-grained enough data, so literally that period lasts only a few weeks, and I didn't have enough data in that period, so I didn't have a chance to observe it. But as far as culture shock, disillusionment, adjustment, and integration, yes, that's definitely what I saw, and it usually takes about 2 years before people become integrated and adjusted to culture. Again, it may depend on the individual person. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower, but that's what I saw in my own research. So when you go to a different country, you likely will experience all those 4 stages, and it's kind of important that you recognize what stage you're at so that you're not too excited or too disappointed, because as I said, it will change over time. As you see, the graph kind of goes up and down. Reverse culture shock. That's an interesting phenomenon. So you go to a foreign country and you experience the culture shock, but then over time you adjust. That is not over. The problems are not over. The next time you will experience problems is when you will come back to your home country and when you will try to reintegrate in your home culture. And so this experience, I would compare it to the experience that you have when you go and visit your parents after living overseas or away for years. Like that happens to me, for example, even though I was born and raised, largely raised until the age of 16 in Ukraine. When I go back, you would think I would know how it works. You would think that I'm, fully integrated in that culture, but actually it's quite a shock every time. My parents are not exactly what I may remember. Things are not exactly the way they used to be, or at least the way I remember them. I've changed, and so in many cases going back to the culture where you came from is an equally shocking experience as going to a completely new culture. So many things may look strange. Some things are like purely technical. Like for example, when I go back and visit the house in which I grew up, the ceilings seem much lower than they were, or the way I remember them. And then there would be some little things that are like, oh, I didn't think it was so. But there will be some also, as I said, cultural issues, some interaction issues, some things that were perfectly normal at the time when you lived there, but now all of a sudden look strange to you because your attitudes have changed. And so that's definitely the case in the business environment. So you come to your organization after 2 years overseas, and even though it's the same company, the same people, the same geographic location, many things now all of a sudden look strange to you. Many things that you accepted before now look different or strange because now you know other ways of doing things, and the way they're done at the company where you used to be, that doesn't make sense to you. So that reintegration takes sometimes some effort and challenges. Another issue that is not discussed in your textbook is this whole idea of the cultural looseness and tightness. Michelle Gelfand has been doing some research on the topic. She, by the way, or at least used to be at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. But anyway, she and her team looked at or defined the concept of cultural looseness and tightness. And so some cultures are culturally loose. Like, for example, in the United States, even though the culture is very distinct, but it's not very tight as far as deviation from those cultural norms are okay. So if you do not conform to the American culture, it's okay. Nobody's going to care that much about it. But you go to, for example, Japan or South Korea, that culture is much tighter. So there is also a distinct culture, but the problem there is, or not problem, a feature of that culture is that any deviation from that norm is frowned upon or is a big deal. And so for expatriates going from a loose country to, or culturally loose society to a culturally tight society, adjustment usually is much harder than the other way around. So when you send a person from the United States to Japan, that person is likely going to have a hard time adjusting because all of a sudden you have these narrow norms that you have to follow, and any deviation is a big problem. Whereas when you have someone from, let's say, Japan coming to the United States, adjustment is much easier because whatever you do is kind of okay. And even though the distance between the countries, the cultures, the difference between the cultures is the same no matter which way you go. I mean, Japan is as different from the United States as the United States is different from Japan. But going from one to the other, the direction of that movement may actually play a huge role in your ability to adjust. And so here this graph basically shows you it's almost like going uphill or downhill. The distance is the same, but covering the distance may take much less effort if you go downhill, or much more effort when you go uphill. Now, no surprises on the exam. Here is a question that I hope you can answer now. Again, I'm going to read it out for you. Which of the two relates to how CQ is measured. A. 2 plus 2 equals question mark. B. On a scale from 1 to 7, how well do you think you know the answer to the question 2 plus 2 equals question mark? And obviously when we talk about cultural intelligence skills, CQ-B is a much closer fit. That's usually the model that is used to measure cultural intelligence. Now, what else matters? Again, going back to my dissertation research that I conducted, must have been like 7 years ago or so, I was looking at integration of Canadian immigrant workers at their companies and in the Canadian society in general. And I was trying to see why some people integrate so fast, become Canadianized or Americanized here in the United States so fast, and others seem to never acculturate. They may spend years and years and maybe even decades, and they're still distinctly foreign. They're still not cowboys or Canadians, right? So why that happens? And I discovered a number of moderators, a number of things that help, but the strongest moderator was the frequency of the contact with the locals. So the time didn't really matter that much. You can be in the country for a few months versus a few years. But what mattered was how frequently you communicate with the locals. And the way I operationalized that, I had a bunch of questions, but I also measured what percentage in the network of the people with whom the respondents communicated on a regular basis, what percentage of those people were locals, were Canadians. And the breaking point seemed to be about 15%. So in other words, if of all the people with whom you communicate on a regular basis are locals, or locals constitute less than 15%, over time I found that people not only not acculturate, they actually tend to reject the host culture. They actually become much less Canadian than they were at the time when they came. And vice versa. If it's more than 15%, especially if it's much more, people acculturate much faster. Now, there are many implications of this finding. First, obviously, you know, when you have, for example, foreign students or foreign employees at your company, what companies sometimes do, they try to help those foreigners by putting them together so that they are among their own kind. And that usually doesn't help at all. So by putting them in that kind of silo where they are together, you actually limit their contact with the locals. And as a result, you may have people who don't assimilate fast enough. And sometimes when they're completely isolated, for example, I'm looking here, we're talking here about, like, for example, domestic terrorism in some European countries like the UK, for example, or France. When you look at where those people come from, even though they were born in the UK or France or whatever other country, they usually live in those kind of isolated, like, ghetto communities where only people from their own country live. And they virtually have no contact with locals, like Canadians or Americans, or, you know, in that case, British or French. And so over time, they not only not internalize the values of the country in which they now live, they actually reject it and become anti-French or anti-British. And that is a very important, you know, thing, because, you know, it's a huge deal. So if you want your employees to acculturate or to assimilate or to integrate, you should promote that interaction. So assign them to share, you know, be roommates with a local guy. Try to have more social events where they meet local people. You know, almost force them to interact more. Send them to, you know, local, I don't know, school where they would interact with locals. Whatever else you can do to promote that interaction, because that interaction matters a lot. At the same time, sometimes you may not want them to acculturate. For example, if you send an expatriate from the headquarters to specifically kind of monitor the operations at the subsidiary, you may not want those people to go native, right? You may want them to remain headquarter men as opposed to subsidiary men. And in that case, maybe you should minimize those social interactions, because the more they interact, the more they will become part of that group and not part of your headquarter group. And so sometimes you may not want that to happen. But anyway, just a tool, you know, how you use it, it's up to you. But it's very important that contact frequency seems to be a deal breaker. That contact frequency is much more important than, for example, how much time people spent overseas, what they did there. It's much more about how frequently they communicated with foreigners. So just because someone lived in Saudi Arabia for 5 years doesn't necessarily make that person, adjusted enough, because he could have lived in a gated community for expatriates and never had any contact with the locals, which, by the way, happens a lot in Saudi Arabia. But anyway, finally, designing cross-cultural training. So how do you do it right? We've talked about so many problems. The question is, how do you do it right? Well, there are 5 steps that need to be taken, and let me tell you, I know you will not believe me, but when you will finally or when you will be in the field, when you will be in an organization, you will see that is usually the case, that these steps are not taken. And here are the steps. First, you have to identify the type of global assignment for which cross-cultural training is needed. So before you even start designing your training, think about who's going to be the recipient, what kind of assignment the person has, why the person is going overseas, and only then you determine the specific goals and needs of that person. If the person is going only for 1 month versus 5 years, with family, without family, the needs of that person will be different, and so the different types of training may be needed. And believe me, hardly ever that is assessed. As I said, it's usually one-size-fits-all training, and we just hope that it works. But if you want to do it right, you have to look at those things even before you get to the design of the training. Then, once you know what the needs are, that's when you start thinking about the goals, and more importantly, how will you measure if those goals are achieved. So you know now who goes where, why they go it, what needs they have, and then what are the goals, or what kinds of skills or abilities are needed to be able to integrate there. And more importantly, how will you measure those specific goals when the training is over? So those first 3 steps have to be taken even before you start developing the training. And then only when you know what exactly you want to alter, what specific skills you want to teach, that's when you start developing the training. And you design the exercises that you put in the training to specifically improve those skills or abilities, not just standard stuff. Let's talk about cultural models, Hofstede, individual and collectivism. No, maybe it's not needed. Maybe the needs of the person are completely different. So that's very important that you establish that. And so then you develop and deliver the training. And then again, hardly ever you see evaluation of that training effectiveness. Hardly ever you actually see the trainers or the company or the employees to evaluate whether or not it actually worked. And that's a very important step, especially if you do it professionally. It's very important that every time you deliver training, you actually try to evaluate if it worked or not. Because if you don't know what works, what doesn't, if it works or if it doesn't, and how you need to do it next time. So again, frankly, from what I've seen, it's usually step 4 and nothing else. So it's no step 1, 2, 3, and no step 5. Anyway, how would you evaluate training effectiveness? Well, my favorite model is that developed by Kirkpatrick. A long time ago, it's been modified and updated since then, but it's a good one because it looks at different types of outcomes. And so I'm gonna, the last 7 minutes or so of this presentation, I'm going to basically give you a presentation that I gave a week ago at the Academy of International Business Conference, where I talked about effectiveness of Acculturation, that project that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. So we not only train our students how to perform or be a member of a global virtual team, but we actually rigorously evaluate whether or not what we do matters. And so the way we evaluate it is we look at reactions of the students as well as instructors. Happy, satisfied, learning. Did students actually learn something? And so learning is different from being happy, as well as different from actually doing things differently. So it's purely knowledge, right? We look at behaviors, changes in behaviors. So do now people following the training do things differently? They may be happy, they may have the knowledge, but they may still do the things the old way. And so we're trying to see if they actually do it a different way. Then we look at the results. Do those new behaviors actually lead to better performance? More profits for the company, for example, better business plan that the teams write. And finally, what is the return on investment? For each dollar that you invested in the training, how much you can get in return. And so let me give you my own study as an example. And so as you know, for the take-home assignment, you will have to develop your own training evaluation effectiveness program. And so you can follow the same scheme. So in this study, as you see, I had many co-authors. So we had many people. We had participants from all these countries that you see here on the graph. And obviously, experiential learning is a sexy term, and everybody talks about the need for one. but does it really work? And so we wanted to see if Acculture, an experiential learning project, if it really works or not. We had, as I said, Acculture project as our research platform with about 3,000 students from about 80 universities in 40-something countries. And so with many people and so many resources invested in the project, we better know if it really works. And so here are some of the pictures of our students, and again, some of you, by the way, who took my Management 301 class, you may be on some of these pictures because you were part of the project. And so I'm not sure if I actually have any American students here. Yes, I actually didn't, unfortunately, so you were not in the pictures. So anyway, as we go through the project, we collect all kinds of data. So we have self-report data where students report to us before the project starts, weekly during the project, after the project. We have peer evaluations, we have expert evaluations, we have your performance and participation records, we have course evaluations, we have all that kind of stuff. And so we were trying to use those data to answer whether or not the training that we deliver works. First, we looked at reactions. And so basically just ask students if they thought that the course was useful or not. And so when we asked them, about 95% said that yes, they felt it was a very interesting and useful project. Though there were about 4% of the participants who said that no, it was not a good project. So that tells us something. When we asked them on a scale from 1 to 7, how useful did you see the project to be? The average was roughly between somewhat useful, I learned a lot, I learned something, to very useful, I learned a lot. Then we also looked at course evaluations. We wanted to see if students who had Acculture as part of their course were happier with the course than those who didn't have Acculture. And I teach normally multiple sections of my international business course, as well as many other professors do. And so we would deliver exactly the same course with exactly the same lectures, same exams to two different groups of students, but one of them will have a domestic project, the other one would have Acculture. And so we wanted to see if there would be differences in course evaluations, and sure enough they were. So students who had Acculture as part of their class actually were much happier with the course in general than those who didn't have Acculture. Then we also asked the same thing of instructors. Did you feel that the project was effective for your students? And again, the vast majority of the instructors felt that it was. And so they would actually say things like, the project considerably enhanced learning in my course. Then we looked at learning. So we wanted to see if students actually learned something. So for example, we would measure cultural intelligence before and after the project, and then we would see if there is any improvement. Obviously, measuring only after wouldn't give us much information because, we wouldn't know if it improved or not. Maybe people were culturally intelligent before the project started. And so we would ask before and after, and sure enough, we saw approximately a 10% improvement in cultural intelligence. That tells us something. Then we would also ask people if first, before the project starts, what they think the challenges will be, but then after the project is over, what the actual challenges were. And so the difference between those two presumably would tell us that after the project, students know better what the actual challenges of global virtual collaboration are. And again, we saw a significant difference there, presumably an indicator of that now people know better. So again, it's very important to note one more time that we did a before and after assessment, because one-time measurement may not be sufficient. Plus, we also looked at course test performance. So in the classes where we had Acculture and in the classes where we didn't have Acculture, students would get not only the same lectures but also the same tests. And we would actually try to see if students who have Acculture do better on the tests, like for example the one that you have in this course. And interestingly, we saw an improvement. There was approximately 5% better performance on the tests among the students who had Acculture in their course. So that tells us that students actually learn something, because those multiple choice questions that they have, they actually can answer them more correctly. Then we looked at changes in attitudes. So we looked at, for example, how people perceive cultures to be different. So before the project and after the project, we would ask them how similar or different do you see cultures represented on your team. And so we'll also ask all kinds of questions about, stereotypes, prejudice, racism. And interestingly, we would see approximately 10% improvement from before to after. So people wouldn't see their teammates as different as they thought they were at the beginning of the project. People would be much less stereotypical, much less prejudiced towards people from other cultures. So attitudes did change. We also looked at, for example, what we call self-efficacy, or attitudes or perceptions about how ready you are to work with people from other cultures. So before the project starts and after the project ends, we would ask, how easy or difficult do you think it would be to work with people from these cultures? And the change here was not as dramatic as in other cases, but still we saw a 2% drop. So people were more confident in their ability to collaborate with people from different cultures. Not much, but still some improvement. Then we looked at changes in behaviors. Again, so we now know they were happy. We now know they learned something. We now know they believe different things now or have different views. But does it change their behavior? And so we had two tests here. One was we asked people after the project if they would do anything differently had they to do the project again. And 92% of the people said, yes, I will do things differently next time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they actually will, but at least now they aspire to do things differently, so that gives us some indication that probably the behaviors will change. Also, we had a bunch of people who actually participated in Acculture multiple times. Some just for fun, others took different courses from the same professor, and even though the courses were different, Acculture was still part of the project, so we had some people who participated multiple times, and we could observe their behaviors the first and the second time. And sure enough, we saw that people behaved differently. The second time they would communicate more frequently, they would communicate they would spend longer time communicating with their peers, they would do coordination differently, they would use more advanced online collaboration tools such as Google Docs and Facebook and stuff like that. So there were substantial differences in their behavior. They were much more likely to, for example, become leaders of their teams. They were much less likely to procrastinate. So we saw substantial differences in behaviors, changes in behaviors. That's good. Finally, did that affect their performance? Yes, it did. Teams that had second timers, people who participated the second time, actually wrote better reports, and on average they would get higher ratings not only for the report that they wrote, but also they would get higher peer evaluations. So it seems like they both individually were perceived as better performers, but also the objective measures, like when experts evaluated the reports that they wrote, those were better as well. So what? Well, in our project we actually saw that Acculture does improve satisfaction, changes learning, changes attitudes, changes behaviors, and leads to higher performance. Again, more studies may be needed to fully understand what the impact of the program is, but by using those control groups and treatment groups, by using before and after measurements, by using all kinds of assessments, we can at least say that we have a good evidence that the program that we deliver works. So for your take-home assignment, you would have to do the same thing. So the question would be whether or not the program that you design works, and you would have to give me these specific measures as to how would you know if the training program that you design or recommend is effective. Anyway, enough for today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll see you in my next video lecture.